Okay, so now that we've talked about the scientific process, it's time for an overview of biology. So what is biology exactly? Well, the word biology breaks down into two components, bios, which means life, as you see here, and logi or logia, which means the study of. So in a nutshell, biology is concerned with the study of life. So in some ways, it winds up being simplest to define biology in terms of the boundaries and to come up with some criteria that define whether or not something is alive. We often see this coming up with space exploration, trying to search for living things. So to help us think about what distinguishes living from non-living things, here's some stuff to consider. So in this picture, on the left-hand side, we've got a tiny animal that's known as a tardigrade. These are also referred to as water bears. So most of the time, these tardigrades are just microscopic little consumers. They swim around in watery habitats all across the globe, and they eat things like algae, bacteria, and tiny invertebrates. So here's one just kind of wiggling around with a shiny stomach. However, if the local conditions aren't great, tardigrades have some interesting tricks up their sleeves. So for example, if they're in an environment that experiences drought and there isn't any water, under those conditions, tardigrades can almost completely dehydrate, and they turn into this almost completely metabolically inactive form called a tun. So that's what's pictured right here. So here's a fully hydrated tardigrade. Here's a tardigrade that's switched over to the tun form. And they can actually stay in the tun form for upwards of 30 years before they rehydrate, forage, and reproduce. So I want to contrast that with another thing that's pictured on this slide towards the right. And this right here is an image of a type of virus that's called a bacteriophage, because bacteriophages, they specialize on invading bacteria. So this bacteriophage actually shares a lot of things in common with the tardigrade, but biologists would distinguish the tardigrade as being a living thing, and they distinguish the bacteriophage as not being a living thing. So this brings us to one of our major themes of biological inquiry, which is kind of the theme of unity. And one of the big questions that biologists grapple with is, so what is it that living things share in common? And so collectively, for the moment, so here's a list of the things that biologists have come up with that living things share in common. And over the course of this semester and next semester, we're going to tackle many of the elements of this theme of unity. For example, one of the reasons why this tardigrade is considered to be alive, but the bacteriophage is not, is because this tardigrade is built out of cells. And this bacteriophage does not share all of the structural elements that make a cell, as we will see. And at the same time, though, we should note that the tardigrade and the bacteriophage do share some of these other properties in common. So for example, they both obey the laws of physics and chemistry. You could also argue that both the tardigrade and the bacteriophage grow, develop, and reproduce, so a couple of these other characteristics. Although in the case of the bacteriophage, these processes are entirely dependent on a host bacterium. So bacteriophages cannot do these things independently. And living things, also in contrast, have methods to respond to their environment and practice regulation. So if you think about what I mentioned in terms of water for the tardigrade, for example, so a tardigrade can respond to water availability in its environment. And we would not observe a bacteriophage doing these things directly, right? So bacteriophages basically don't have mechanisms to respond to their environment. However, both the bacteriophage and the tardigrade do require energy, although this bacteriophage won't process that energy directly. And you could argue that both of these things, both the tardigrade and the bacteriophage, show some evidence of evolutionary adaptation. But we're going to dive into some of the details of that later in the semester. One other note for you, anywhere that you see this symbol on a slide, that's a note that the slide contains information that I expect you to know. So in general, I'm not huge on just strict memorization, but I do think it's very useful to have a good working knowledge of this list. So this is an exception to that. And even more than that, I think it's important to be able to distinguish living from non-living things. So again, just means learn the information on this slide. Okay, so the theme of unity, all the characteristics shared by living things, is one theme for inquiry in biology, but it's not the only one. So some additional themes relate to the concept of organization, and I'm going to talk a bit more about that in a minute. And then studies of the flow of energy and matter, and about the nature of interactions, so both internal interactions and interaction with the surrounding environment. So we're going to see these themes come up in a range of ways as we continue our studies. So here I just want to highlight how these themes intersect with the characteristics of living things, right? So that kind of comes into play with the characteristics here that are highlighted in red. Okay, so now I want to just briefly touch on this concept of organization and what the concept of organization means for living things. So one way to make sense of the living world is to think about it in terms of a hierarchy of organization, which is what I've outlined over here on the right side of this slide. So the simplest level of organization is here at the bottom, just in terms of thinking about the types of molecules that are found in living things. And we're going to actually be starting at the base of this hierarchy and working our way up over the course of this semester. So molecules then get packaged into various organized systems called organelles, and those organelles are structures that are found within cells. In more complex organisms, groups of cells of the same type that work together are then organized into tissues, and tissues then collaborate with each other to form organs and organ systems, which are going to be specialized subunits that are found within an organism. The hierarchy actually doesn't stop at the individual organism either, so groups of organisms of the same species will make up a population. Then populations of different organisms that interact with each other then form ecological communities. And ecological communities also interact with their non-living surroundings, so the combination of both living and non-living things found in an environment then form a collective that's called an ecosystem. And then at the highest level of organization here on planet Earth, this entire collective is known as the biosphere. So in thinking about this theme of organization, many biologists wind up focusing their attention on just one or two of these levels of biological organization. So for example, most biochemists would kind of think of themselves down here, focusing on different types of molecules, how they're structured, and how they interact. But it's really important to recognize that there are often cases where you can't predict what's going to happen at a higher level of organization based on knowing something about one of these lower levels of organization. So to give you an example, we're going to think about this bird here. It's called a crossbill. So this is the white-winged crossbill. And there's a little video about them here. It's about 2 minutes long, just so you can learn a little bit more about how they work. So, birds in general use their beaks or their bills as a way to gather food. And so in that regard, it seems like having a crossed bill would be a really terrible way to gather food. You really can't pick anything up directly with a bill that's shaped like this. So, how can this bill be explained? Well, the bill really only makes sense in the wider context of where this bird is found. So you see, crossbills are found in environments where there are trees that produce seeds that are protected by cones that have really tough scales. And it turns out that this crossed bill shape is actually absolutely fantastic for prying open cones to extract the seeds inside. And this is just one example of an emergent property. So an emergent property is something that might seem inexplicable out of context, but it starts to make a lot more sense when you consider the larger biological setting where it occurs. So we can't really make sense of the bird without knowing more about its specific food type. And to give you a second fairly vivid example, there are also a lot of cases that can happen where people discover a chemical that seems like it might be a really promising treatment for a disease or condition, when it's initially tested in a petri dish. However, we've learned from many, many experiences that it's unwise to go straight from a petri dish to a human treatment because the human body is also a complex system that has its own emergent properties. And the human body is so complex that we still have a lot to learn when it comes to understanding all of those emergent properties. So we can't yet go straight from a petri dish to an entire human being when we discover something that might be, a beneficial cure of some sort. So now, two other themes in biology are the themes of information and evolution. And we're going to encounter these themes as we learn more about the fundamental mechanisms by which organisms reproduce. And in the last portion of the course, we're going to lay out how this process of evolution works. And then lastly, I want to touch on one remaining theme that actually contrasts with the first theme that we started out with, that theme of unity. And this is the theme of diversity. So it exists in tension with the theme of unity as a contrasting point. So for all the characteristics that living things share in common, as we survey the living world around us, it's also very apparent that there's a tremendous wealth of different ways that different organisms have found to survive and persist in this world. I really love this picture because of this giant deep sea crab here that just has crazy long legs. And again, out of context, how do we make sense of that? Where did this crab come from? How does it work? And, how is it that we have, wild animals that look like that crab and then other animals that, we might encounter in our everyday life that look very different from that? So we have to grapple with this theme of diversity in contrast with the theme of unity. And one of the ways that biologists have worked to make sense of the broad diversity of living things is to come up with systems to classify living things according to how they're related to each other. And so as we get underway with our explorations in biology, we're going to start out working with the very broadest level of classification into three main groups or domains of organisms. So two of these groups are single-celled, and these two groups are collectively referred to as the prokaryotes. That's pictured down here. So that includes the bacteria over here on the left and the archaea over here on the right. And while these prokaryotes are generally thought to be simple organisms, they're also ancient and they're highly abundant and they're highly diverse. So they can teach us a ton about the nature of living things. And then the third group pictured here are the eukaryotes. So up top, eukaryotes are generally more complex and they can be found in both single-celled and multicellular forms. And I think the eukaryotes are really great because they also reveal biology's creativity and ability to become more complex. Okay, so that's a broad picture of kind of the topics we're going to touch on in this course. I'm also going to note that next semester your focus is going to be on some slightly different aspects of living things. But altogether, I hope that this picture helps you to get excited to learn more about just how it is that living organisms work.